Hello, welcome to Nexus Webinar 6, the final in our series. From here on out, you can check out our website for future creative content that we will be developing over the next several months. As for questions, we will answer them via chat and we'll respond at the end of the webinar. I'm David Laverty. I'm here with Paul Golden and Dave Weisensell. We're bringing to you cannabis greenhouse growing methods for production and profitability. And I'm going to turn it over to Paul.
Thank you, David. First thing I'd like to do is go over the outline of the presentation today. And our main focus today is going to be the methods for commercial growing. We're going to start with consumer safety. We're going to talk about organic versus conventional growing. We're going to talk about choice of the growing media, the growing platform, how you're growing, whether you're growing on a bench or on the ground, irrigation and fertigation techniques, automation inside the greenhouse. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how you might be limited by your canopy size or your plant count. And then lastly, we're going to follow up with supply and demand, yields, and overall profitability of the greenhouse. So it's important to keep in mind anytime you're raising a consumer product that consumer health and protection must come into mind. Cannabis testing laboratories must include identification and quantities of the following components and the potential contaminants relevant to public health. These fall into the following categories: pesticides, and pesticides vary from state to state, so you'll have to make sure what you're approved for use. Approved pesticides might vary depending on the application, whether you're using it for cleaning or whether you're using it for pest prevention on the plant. Cannabinoids. This is your THCA, your THC, your CBD, your CBDA. So these are the different components that you're raising the crop for. Then you get microbiology. This is the different pathogens that can possibly be in the crop from contamination from water or from any other kind of source. Volatile organic compounds. If you're a mixed producer, then you will probably have different types of solvents that you use for extracting the cannabinoids out of the raw flower, and these solvents will be tested for. And then lastly, water concentration. So obviously your flowers, your dry buds have to be dry enough to prevent mold from happening when they're in the packaging.
One thing I'd like to mention about pesticides is nowadays the products are labeled very, very well. So there's a number of different testing agencies, and you'll see those labels right on your actual pesticide, and you'll be able to tell which ones you should use for this particular crop and which ones are okay to use.
That's correct. OMRI-listed products are typically going to be dealt with on a state-by-state basis, and you'll have to follow up with your local authorities and make sure that you're using the product properly.
One thing I'd like to add is here in Colorado, there's been a move towards much more conformity and consistency in packaging. When cannabis was first legalized, there were higher thresholds that obviously caused some issues with dosing, and now the lower dosage amounts are contributing to more consistency throughout the market.
So some of the factors that affect both the product safety and the quality will include your seeds and clones, so whether these are sourced from a good source. Obviously, the garbage in equals garbage out if you have bad seeds or bad clones. Soil and media, or as we call it, substrate in the industry, can vary from grower to grower, technique to technique. It's important to make sure that you have quality substrate and that it's prepared properly and it's safe. Also, typically you'll have to have some kind of waste management practice in place for dealing with the spent substrate. Plant management, which basically has to do with spacing, weeding, cropping of the plants, and minimizing injury to the plant. A lot of times you'll see plants held up by trellis and things of that nature to prevent the plant from getting injured. Water quality, this is one of the most important aspects of growing. Typically speaking, there's either ground source water or surface water, and then lastly, you can have municipal water. So if you're using ground source water, that tends to be a little cleaner. Using surface water, you have to have more concern about safety.
One quick thing about water, it's very important that you have your water tested prior to starting your grow, and you're going to have a whole list of different components that are in that water. Some of them you'll want, some of them you won't. So it's just important to know your starting line base.
That's absolutely true. Fertilizers and soil amendments are commonly used for growing cannabis. Organic fertilizers don't always imply a high-quality product or increased yields. Plenty of growers grow under conventional methods. However, most of our growers that are in greenhouses call themselves organic growers and tend to use the organic fertilizers. Then you got disease and pests. An integrated pest management practice is going to be important whether you're growing in a warehouse or a greenhouse. Greenhouse doesn't necessarily imply you have more concern over pests than a warehouse environment. It's just a common thing that every type of grower has to deal with. Then you have post-harvest handling. This is the trimming and the storage of the products. It's important to maintain good hygiene practices in that environment, and also to have your employees maintain good hygiene practices to keep your product clean. And then lastly, storage. Obviously, the containers need to be clean, and then also the atmosphere inside the environment where it's being stored. In the vault, for example, it must be the right humidity levels, or else you could run into problems with mildew or something like that breaking out inside the vault.
Dropping back to integrated pest management, I just want to mention there's a series of different components that come together to managing your pests, and it's really important to stay on top of all three of them. One of the things that people will do is actually release biologics. That could be ladybugs or other types of beetles that are meant to eat some of the pests. But really staying on top of your pest management in advance is the best way to keep your pests under control.
That's correct. In integrated pest management, as you mentioned, you need a lot of different things. Biologicals are just one arm of the total integrated pest management routine, and you would have other things in place like insect screening, as well as hygiene inside the greenhouses, keeping weeds down and things of that nature. And then also part of your integrated pest management practices will be when to apply the pesticides and how to apply them properly. And so that plays an important role. Greenhouses are used around the world to grow high-quality crops for human consumption, and so growers should look to the standard SOPs of other greenhouse industries to base their practices off of. So this would include fertilizer storage and handling, monitoring of water quality, and other incoming items into the greenhouses that might carry pathogens. Waste management is a big issue, especially when it comes to irrigation runoff. If you're recycling your irrigation water, obviously cleaning that irrigation water up again before reusing it is important. And then having a good cleaning schedule or maintaining a good cleaning schedule, along with other good agricultural practices, is very important. Lastly, you have post-harvest management. So this is anything from your plants to your pots and your soil. Obviously, every step along the way there has to be well thought out and controlled.
I'd also like to add that having good communication with the state regulatory agency is crucial. It keeps open communication, prevents other issues from coming up, and can prevent negative compliance situations down the line.
Along with that topic, kind of ties in, some of the different facilities are held to very high standards. If you're creating an edible, for instance, you're going to be held to food processing standards. If you're creating an extract, then you may actually be held to medical grade standards. So there's a number of things you want to keep in mind. They all kind of have to do with cleanliness, but overall standards that you need to adhere to.
One of the common questions we get asked about is organic growing versus conventional growing. And so what I'd like to do here is outline a few talking points around each and kind of go through the pros and cons of each style of growing. Starting with organic growing, first, there's no nationally accepted standard for organic cannabis cultivation. So you would be working either on a state level or you'd be basically making your own standard for organic growing. It's easy to do in a greenhouse, mostly because we don't have a high demand for pesticides in a greenhouse environment like you would with an open field crop. We insect screen almost all of our cannabis greenhouses down to 150 microns, which is smaller than the size of a thrift. Typically, a organic grower is going to be growing in soil with amendments. Now, sometimes it's not always soil, sometimes it's cocoa or peat-based, but most often it's soil and they amend it through fertigation. It's a little harder to automate the fertigation process. The process of fertigation is injecting nutrients into your irrigation water. And because organic nutrients tend to clog up irrigation lines a little bit more, it becomes a little bit more challenged to use the standard practices that are adopted throughout the rest of the greenhouse industry for irrigation. Also, it's a little bit more challenging to dose properly or accurately with organic nutrients because you really never have a sense of how much readily available nutrients there is to the plant and how much is locked up in an organic pond. Generally speaking, the cost of producing organically is a little bit more, but there's definitely a potential for greater demand with that product. And as you might notice, when you go through the dispensaries, there's quite a few products on the shelf that are labeled as organic.
Typically, they're going to command a higher price.
That's correct. It's not necessarily more healthy or safe to grow organically. Certainly, there are organic, OMRI-approved pesticides out there and fertilizers that would be unsafe if they were used in the wrong way. And runoff from either the pesticide or the fertilizer is still of concern, even though it's labeled organic.
Well, just as there is a strong trend towards organic food consumption in stores, the same applies to cannabis. Sometimes the differences may not be that much, but it's often an issue of perception. And so whatever you can do to be as organic as possible is going to be a plus in the consumer marketplace as well as help your company.
So now let's look at the option of doing conventional growing. It can be hydroponic, in soil, or a substrate such as rock wool. It's easy to automate in most cases because you're using a salt-based fertilizer or a liquid fertilizer of a known concentration, which you can easily apply some math to figure out the proper dosing rates. It generally costs less to produce. Not necessarily greater yields, even though you're using these high-strength fertilizers. Yields can vary based off the grower's experience and many other inputs that go into the crop. You might have to be more concerned with runoff. Typically speaking, a conventional grower would do more flushing of the system to flush the salts out of the root ball, and that typically means a little bit more runoff. And then it's still limited to the products approved by for cannabis cultivation.
So the choice to grow organically or to grow conventionally, possibly hydroponically, is a personal one, and oftentimes it's decided by what does your head grower feel most comfortable with.
So the next option to most growers is how to grow, what kind of media to grow with. You can grow in soil or you can grow in inert substrates. Soil is still very commonly used. Soil is either in the pots, in raised beds, or you plant directly into the ground if you have good soil where you're at. It can be expensive if you're purchasing a pre-mixed soil, but it can be very cheap if you have a good source of clean soil. And what I mean by clean soil is it's free of eggs, from different pests, and it doesn't have any harmful contaminants in it. It's easy to balance nutrients in a soil-based system in most cases. There's natural bacteria that take place inside that soil, and it kind of converts nutrients over so the plant can use it properly. One downfall about soil is it's very bulky, and so it takes a lot of space to store it, and typically speaking, you want to store that in a warehouse environment just so it's not freezing in the wintertime or getting wet this spring. It is possible to recycle soil, but you have to have the proper practices to compost it. The next option for most growers is inert substrates, such as cocoa or peat. These are very common because they're readily available for large-scale producers. Most often this is in pots. It's not as expensive as the high-end pre-made soils, but it's not as cheap as making your own soil. Typically speaking, it's pH stable. It's adjusted for its EC as well, its salt content, and it's easy to fertigate and monitor. One of the reasons being is oftentimes you can just measure the leachate that comes off that substrate, and it'll tell you how much salt is in that substrate. It comes sterilized, which is a huge benefit for most growers. It does, however, require storage. Some growers can recycle or will recycle their cocoa and peat. However, it does have a limited lifetime. Next, you have the option of rock wool. Rock wool used to be very common for commercial crops such as tomatoes and cucumbers. Still kind of is. Definitely, there's a lot of guys that use it for propagation, cloning, And there's some guys that choose to do their entire grow out inside rock wool. It's most commonly used with an automated drip system, but you can use flood tables. It's a bit expensive. It is, however, pH stable, and it's easy to adjust the fertilizer concentration at the root ball. It's easy to monitor it as well. It is a one-time use product, and it's not recyclable, and it comes sterilized. Then you have other options such as aeroponics, which are medialess techniques. So aeroponics, NFT, deep water culture, these are all forms of hydroponics. They're very popular on the small scale in the basement and in the closet grows. And some systems are more resilient than others. For example, the deep water culture is a pretty resilient system. Aeroponics and NFT, if the pump goes out, you're going to lose your crop pretty quickly. They've never really been adapted to the large-scale greenhouse environment, just mainly because they're expensive at larger scales and they don't have the resiliency that most growers are looking for.
So when you're trying to decide whether you want to grow in soil or whether you'd like to grow hydroponically, a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that soil tends to be more stable and it's a larger buffer, so your pH and your nutrient content doesn't shift as quickly, so it's harder to kind of mess up, whereas a hydroponic system can very rapidly change. There's no soil to deal with, so it has some advantages, but if you do screw up the pH or screw up your nutrient regime, you can really screw up your plants very rapidly.
That's a good point. So next, I'd like to go on to what's your growing platform? And by this, I mean, how are you growing in the greenhouse? Are you growing in pots on the ground? Are you growing in raised beds? Are you growing on pots on rolling benches or stationary benches? Are you growing in rock wool cubes on a gutter system, such as Cannabis would be used? Or are you planting directly in the ground? We've seen all these practices used around the country. In some places, one practice might be more valid than others. Still today, most commonly we see pots on benches.
Now, it's important here to take a look at your efficiency because each one of these is going to have a different amount of utilization. Here at Nexus, we've had solid success in getting clients to grow with benches to be able to increase their utilization. So keep that in mind when you're deciding on your growing platform.
Getting into rolling benches, this is one of the best ways of maximizing usable space. It goes anywhere from 80 to 90% fill factor inside the greenhouse. You can see a demonstration of the rolling benches off to the right-hand side here, where we have all the benches touching each other. Each bench top rolls to the side and allows for a movable aisle, so you can get in there and access the plants when you need to, but you don't need an aisle for every single bench because you can roll the bench side to side to access each individual bench from both sides. The nice thing about benches as a whole is they place plants at appropriate height for workers to work on. So there's a lot of maintenance that takes place on these plants, typically topping them, and then also just training them and kind of trellising them as well so they don't break under the weight of their buds. So it's a good thing to have a plant that's at an ergonomic height to work at. Another nice thing about any style benches is that they're going to keep the plants off the cold concrete floor or off the cold gravel floor in the greenhouse. That helps promote more root growth because the colder root ball is going to grow slower than a warmer root ball. And then it's also easy to apply root zone heating on a bench system. We can use under bench fin tube to create a nice circular air motion inside the greenhouse that would help dry out the greenhouse, as well as also in the cold winter months, heat up that root ball and accelerate plant growth.
As far as rolling benches go, a rule of thumb that we use in the industry is we say that rolling benches, because of the increased fill factor, will pay for themselves on your very first harvest. So something to keep in mind.
Another thing that we see quite often is growing on the ground, either in pots, raised beds, or in the ground itself. It does, however, utilize less greenhouse space because there's lots of space that's taken up by aisleways. You can, if you're going on a slab or a hard like road base with a weed barrier on top of it, you can install radiant floor heat underneath the plants. Most guys that are growing on the ground tend to grow larger plants, and that's the reason for why they're growing on the ground. It just doesn't make sense to put a 30-gallon pot up onto that bench.
That's oftentimes driven by plant count licensing structures.
That's correct, and we're going to get a little bit more into that in a couple more slides here. And then one of the common practices that are used in different vine crops, such as tomatoes, cucumbers, even peppers, is to grow in gutters. You can see here in the bottom right-hand picture, we have a demonstration of rock wool cubes on top of gutters where they're being irrigated with a drip system. This was really more for a vine crop than it was for cannabis. Simply put, there's more piles than is desired to use this for cannabis, so it doesn't make for great space utilization inside the greenhouse. It is, however, easy to apply root zone heating, and it's a little bit more ergonomical than growing on the ground. Next, let's get the irrigation and fertigation control. So some of the common methods for irrigating would be automatic dosing, which is either dosatron-style injector or a computer-controlled style system where they have pumps that measure out the proper amount of nutrients that go into the irrigation water. Drip irrigation is most common with salt fertilizers. However, we do see people use drip irrigation with different styles of organic growing as well. Misting systems is very common with raised beds, and it's very common if you're using organic fertilizers. Generally speaking, misting systems don't clog as much as drip systems. Ever-put trays, they're very common on rolling benches. You can see an example of that down the lower left-hand corner. This is great if you have to collect your runoff, if you have any concerns about environmental contamination from runoff in the greenhouse. And it's typically used for recirculating systems.
It's also big if you need to watch your water usage, and if that's being monitored by how much water you can actually use, it's very good to recapture your water.
That's true. There are some growers that have very limited water to their site. And then lastly, hand watering. This is still one of the most common ways of growing in the industry. However, this is the most costly form of growing.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of times people hand water because they want to have that intimate contact with the plant and keep an eye on each individual plant to make sure it's growing properly.
But just as in your home, that it may be more efficient to use a sprinkler system, the same is true here. By bringing some technology in, tying it into your environmental control, you can save money and be more energy efficient as well.
Labor is always one of your highest costs.
So when it comes to irrigation, the first thing you have to start with is the quality of water from your source. If it's coming from the city, you have plenty of considerations on what the city's adding to that water to sterilize it, and whether that's harming your plants. If it's coming from a groundwater source, you have considerations of whether that well has been somehow or another contaminated. And if it's coming from a surface water source, such as a pond, then you have much more concerns about algae and contaminants in that surface water. So the first question people ask all the time is, do we need reverse osmosis or ozonation? And typically speaking, that's going to have everything to do with the source of the water. Reverse osmosis typically isn't too common on city water, but it depends from municipality to municipality and how much they're adding different chlorides to clean up that water. Ozonation is very common if you have heavy metals inside your well. For example, if you have a lot of iron in the well, you'll have to convert that iron into a form that's not toxic to the plant, so you'll use ozonation. Ozonation is also very common if you're going to be using surface water, because surface water is going to have a number of contaminants, including algae, insect eggs, things of that nature. How often nutrient adjustments are needed will impact the style of nutrient dosing system you're using. If you're changing your nutrient regime a whole lot, A manual dosing system, such as a dosatron, might be cumbersome, and you might want something that has a little bit more computer control. However, that kind of system is going to be a lot more capital than a manual system. If you're doing a single pass, meaning you're doing drain to waste, not a recirculating system, then a manual system seems to work out pretty well. If you're doing a recirculated system, you'll be measuring that nutrients in that water when it comes back to the reservoir and making adjustments. So something that's able to think in real time and make those adjustments to that nutrient reservoir is pretty important.
Another note on reverse osmosis, with the RO machine, you actually lose a fair amount of water. A significant percentage of it goes to waste. So you also want to consider you may have to store that wastewater as well.
Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about opportunities for automation within the greenhouse. It used to be that just large growers would use automated equipment, but with the cost of labor increasing these days and also the ability to get good laborers, you see more and more smaller growers shifting towards the use of automated equipment. Some of the equipment that's been commonly used in the industry are listed below here, shown below here. The first one I'd like to mention is a bale buster, which is off the lower right-hand side. This simply just takes any kind of soil that you have that comes in a bale and mixes it, maybe blends it, and aerates it a little bit so you're able to use it pretty readily. The next thing I'd like to mention is a pot filling station or pot filling machine. They make these all different shapes and sizes for all different styles of pots, completely automated. It saves a lot of work. Certainly seems as though it would be applicable to a lot of the cannabis growers. Conveyor systems. These are really useful for moving heavy pots. With the risk of somebody getting hurt, having a back injury, picking up some of these larger pots and moving from building to building, I can see the use of conveyors becoming more common in the cannabis industry. And then lastly, for the guys that are growing on the ground, plant spacing equipment. You can see up in the upper right-hand corner a different type of tractor that has these forks on it that automatically space out the plants in the greenhouse for you and pick them up and harvest whole rows at a time.
Nowadays, they're even roboticizing a lot of these plant spacing machines.
That's correct. There's ones that don't have any drivers working on them at all. So when it comes to planning your greenhouse facility and determining the size of what you're trying to build, the first thing you'll want to take into consideration is how are you being governed? Is it based off a plant count or canopy size? This will have a big impact on the way you choose to grow. Regulations vary from state to state and by whether or not you're growing for recreational use or medical use. Those regulated by plant count tend to raise larger plants on or in the ground. These would be states like Michigan, for example, or if you're a medical grower where you're limited to a certain number of patients, or you have a lower number of plant count and you're going to raise larger plants. Lastly, those regulated by canopy size tend to raise smaller plants and use more automation.
And do faster turns.
Here in the picture below, you can see larger plants growing on the ground. Then in the middle picture, you can see smaller plants growing the sea of green style on rolling benches with automated irrigation. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see kind of what we recommend as the average size plant, somewhere around 4 square feet per plant, a 2x2 size or whatever, in a 5-gallon pot. And that's more of your scrog technique. It's still trellised. It's probably topped, and it tends to be a little bit larger than your sea of green plants. And that's also grown on a bench.
Your determination of how to space your plants and what size plants to grow really just has to do with what's going to give you the best end yield.
Let's say, for example, you're in Colorado and you have an 1,800 plant count license, and you want to figure out how many plants am I going to harvest per week. So if you're 18 weeks from the time you cut to the time you harvest, and you're counting all your cutting, you're looking at about 100 plants per week. Quickly, you have 1,000 plants just for flowering if you're growing at 10 weeks. Then let's say your veg process takes 6 weeks from the time you get roots on your plant, which means 100 plants per week, and you're doing 6 weeks in veg to support your flowering house. If you're going to spend a week and a half from the time you cut to the time you root, and you wanted to have 100 plants a week transplanted into the veg zone, you would need 150 plants for cuttings. In order to take 100 cuttings per week, you would need approximately 50 mother plants to keep a steady supply of clones. If you add all these numbers together, the 50 mothers, the 1,000 plants in flower, the 600 plants in veg, and the 150 plants in the cloning area, you would have 1,800 plants in total. Still, in the same example, if we were going to have 1,000 plants in flower, and each plant was going to be roughly 4 square feet, we would need 4,000 square feet of actual flowering canopy space. If the grower decided to use rolling benches that filled 80% of the floor space of the greenhouse, he would have to divide that 4,000 square feet by 80% to come up with 5,000 square feet of actual flowering greenhouse space, floor space in the greenhouse. Now assume you have a 2-to-1 ratio of flower space to veg, and you can also have your mothers and clones in that same veg space. This would mean you'd need a total of 7,500 square feet of growing space in order to facilitate your 1,800 plant count. So factoring space for transporting plants, irrigation equipment, storage, and transplanting equipment as well. In locations where the canopy and plant counts do not apply, design for a regular supply of so many pounds per week or so many pounds per month. You got to try to match what you think your market demand will be.
Now let's talk about yields. It's good to utilize high efficiency tools. We've covered rolling benches to increase yields so that you can move your utilization from 60% to 85 to 90%. Now this translates into significant profits. Imagine any business where you increase your overall efficiency from 60 to 85%. That's going to translate to a significant increase in profit. So as we've talked about, with a 12,000 square feet growing space using rolling benches, yields can reach 2,400 pounds per year or higher, and $3 million of revenue for wholesale flower. So if you're doing 24,000 square feet, the $3 million in revenue would double. So you can use this metric in order to predict your output depending upon your greenhouse size. So always look for additional ways to increase yields, including using radiant heat under benches or built into the concrete slab or fertigation systems. These are additional tools to get your plants growing quicker and to increase your overall yield. Okay, supply versus demand. This is an important thing to keep in mind. Supply is moving quickly to meet demand. So when you look at this chart from 2016 through 2021, supply is less than demand, which has led to higher prices. So the closer you get to 2021, supply and demand are going to catch up. So there's still a potential for high profits overall. And supply currently will meet or exceed demand in mature markets sooner, including Colorado, Washington, and Oregon, where there are mature recreational markets. But when supply does reach demand, cost management will be critical as wholesale and retail prices fall. I can't emphasize this enough. As these prices come down, when supply and demand reach their equilibrium point, the best way for you to maintain profit margins is to have solid cost management practices in place throughout your entire greenhouse, your business end as well as your growing and cultivation. Everywhere you'll need to be as efficient as possible.
When it comes down to keeping your costs down, the difference between using the sun's energy in a greenhouse or using electrical energy necessary in a warehouse grow are going to become very important because you're going to be able to produce in a greenhouse at a much lower cost.
And that's an excellent point. Many growers have gone into warehouses because of the illegality of the situation. Now, as laws are changing and growers are coming out of underground grows, it's becoming much more important to be efficient and grow in a greenhouse.
It also has a lower carbon footprint, which is more of a green attitude. Very popular.
Good point. Lastly, let's look at overall profitability. Look to greenhouses as a more cost-effective cost-effective option for cannabis cultivation. And as demand and supply reach equilibrium, look for greenhouses to provide a tool for greater profitability. And with consistent fixed costs, efficiency gains in greenhouse operations fall straight through to the profit line. So anything that you can do to increase your efficiency will have immediate impact on your profits. Now, you're in a risky business. You want to be compensated for taking on that risk. And if you approach your business from an assertive cost management standpoint, you can achieve a 30% profit margin. And this is really important because cannabis businesses are taxed differently than regular businesses and are taxed more on gross revenue than net income or profit. So look for efficiency gains, look for cost management, look for specific ways to increase crop yields, and look for ways to reduce waste in your overall operation. Bring in Lean or Six Sigma practices. The list goes on and on about the ways that you can have a more efficient growing operation that will contribute to overall profitability. I'd like to thank you for attending our webinar. This is our final in our series of 6. We hope you have found this information to be informative and can have a direct benefit on your growing operation. For more information, please visit our website at nexuscan.com, or you can call us anytime at 720-330-0830. You can also send an email directly to info@nexuscan.com as well. So keep in mind that with Nexus, we have 50 years of U.S. manufacturing. We have a long track record. We've certainly been strong in the horticulture industry and still are, and have been able to apply those skills to the emerging cannabis market. And we recently surpassed 1 million square feet